She slammed both hands onto the boardroom table. Every head in the room snapped toward her and said, "Fire him, today, before he destroys everything I've built." Nobody moved. Because the man she wanted gone wasn't an executive. He wasn't a rival. He was the janitor who had carried her down 14 flights of stairs during a blackout, the only man in 3 years who had ever looked at her without pity. And now Evelyn Hart, billionaire CEO, was sitting across from that same man in a rain-soaked diner with a plastic stick on the table between them. What happened next changed both of their lives forever. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves, you subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Daniel Carter had one rule he never broke. He never cried in front of his daughter. And not when the hospital called at 2:47 in the morning 3 years ago. Not when he stood in the parking lot of a Walmart trying to remember what kind of cereal his wife used to buy their little girl, because Sophie had asked for the one mommy always got. And Daniel had stood there for 11 minutes, staring at the shelves, with his jaw locked tight, blinking hard, breathing through his nose until the feeling passed. He was good at making the feeling pass. He was 35 years old, and he had gotten very, very good at it. That Thursday morning started like every other. The alarm on his phone went off at 5:15 a.m., the one with the rooster sound that Sophie had set herself, because she thought it was funny. And Daniel reached across the nightstand, silenced it without opening his eyes, and lay still for exactly 12 seconds. 12 seconds was all he gave himself. Enough time to remember what day it was, what needed to get done, what Sophie would need for school. Then he put his feet on the floor. That was the whole morning ritual. 12 seconds. Feet on the floor. Move. He made eggs because eggs were fast, and Sophie would eat them if he added enough cheese. He packed her lunch turkey, no mustard, the apple slices she liked, because he'd cut the core out so she didn't have to deal with the seeds. He ironed his work shirt standing at the kitchen counter while the coffee brewed because the ironing board had broken in January, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it yet. Sophie came downstairs at 6:40 wearing one pink sock and one white one, her dark hair going in 3 different directions, holding a drawing she'd made. "It's us," she said, holding it up. "That's you. You're the tall one." Daniel looked at the drawing. 2 stick figures, one tall with brown hair, one small with a yellow dress. Both of them smiling enormous smiles, all teeth. "We look happy," he said. "We are happy," Sophie said, completely matter-of-fact, the way 7-year-olds say things they believe entirely. Daniel set the iron down. He looked at his daughter. He nodded once. "Yeah," he said. "We are." He dropped her at school at 7:15, kissed the top of her head, watched her run up the steps without looking back because she was 7, and running was always more interesting than goodbyes. Then he drove to work. Daniel worked building maintenance. He was good at it, better than good. He could diagnose a faulty HVAC unit, the way some men read faces by sound and vibration, and the particular kind of silence that meant something was about to go wrong. He had worked his way up from general labor to senior technician for a company that serviced commercial buildings across the greater Chicago area, which meant some mornings he was in a high school gymnasium, and some mornings he was on the 42nd floor of a glass tower downtown, replacing filters and checking compressors, while the people in expensive suits went about their important lives without ever noticing him. That was fine. Daniel had never needed to be noticed. The Carter Financial Tower on South Wacker was one of his regular assignments, 3rd Thursday of every month. Full systems check 2-hour window before the executive floors came to life. He knew the building the way he knew his own apartment, where the temperamental circuit breaker was on the 4th floor, which elevator shaft had a rattle that wasn't dangerous but sounded like it was, which executive assistant on the 38th floor always left a half-empty coffee pot burning until someone reminded her. He was on his knees inside a utility corridor on the 14th floor, his forearms deep in a ventilation housing when he heard the voice. Not just a voice giving orders. I want the Meridian contract restructured by Monday, not reviewed restructured. There's a difference. If your team doesn't understand the difference, I'd like to know about it before Monday, and not during the presentation. He couldn't see who was speaking. He didn't need to. He had heard Evelyn Hart's voice before on the news and business podcasts. Sophie sometimes complained about when he played them during car rides. Hart Capital Management. The woman who had rebuilt her company from the ground up after an accident that put her in a wheelchair at 36, and then proceeded to triple the company's valuation in 4 years. Daniel had no strong feelings about Evelyn Hart either way. She was a name he recognized. That was all. What he hadn't expected was for her to round the corner of the utility corridor in her wheelchair, moving fast enough that her assistant had to half jog to keep up and to come to a dead stop when she nearly rolled over his legs. "Sorry," Daniel said immediately, pulling back from the ventilation unit and turning. "I should have put a warning sign out. That's on me." Evelyn Hart was looking at him with the particular expression of someone whose morning plan had just encountered an obstacle she hadn't accounted for. She was not what he expected. That was his first thought, and he felt slightly ashamed of it, because what had he expected, he didn't actually know. But up close, she was sharp-featured, composed, wearing a gray blazer that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Her dark hair pulled back with the kind of severity that suggested she found loose ends in any form personally offensive. "You're in the auxiliary corridor," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Scheduled maintenance. Third Thursday." The third Thursday access window is 6 to 8 a.m. "It is," Daniel said. "There was a secondary fault in the lower housing. It took longer than expected." A pause. Her assistant started to say something, and Evelyn held up one hand without looking at him. The assistant stopped mid-syllable. "Is it fixed?" she asked Daniel. "Almost. 40 minutes maybe. I'll be out of your way." She looked at him for a moment, not with impatience exactly, but with the focused attention of someone who was calculating something. Then she said, "The east route to the executive elevator is currently through this corridor." "I know. I can clear enough space for you to pass if you give me 2 minutes." "I don't need you to clear space," she said. "I need you to tell me honestly whether that ventilation fault is going to cause a problem during the 11 o'clock presentation on this floor." Daniel blinked. Most executives in his experience didn't ask him questions like that. They asked the facilities manager, who asked his supervisor, who relayed the question back to Daniel and then relayed the answer back up the chain. "Honestly," he said. "I just said honestly. It won't affect the presentation. The fault is in the return air housing. It's pulling about 8% less efficiently than spec, which means the room might feel slightly warmer than usual after about 90 minutes. If you keep the presentation under that, you won't notice it." Evelyn looked at him. How long will the repair last before it needs to be replaced entirely? "The part 2 to 3 months if you're lucky. I'd schedule a full replacement before winter. I'll have someone contact your company today." She paused. "What's your name?" "Carter. Daniel Carter." "Thank you, Mr. Carter." She looked at her assistant. "Tell facilities I want a full replacement on this unit before October." The assistant made a note. Evelyn Hart maneuvered around the equipment, her wheelchair navigating the corridor with the practiced ease of someone who had long since stopped seeing obstacles as problems to be commented on and continued down the hall. Daniel watched her go and then went back to work. He thought about it for approximately 4 minutes. Then he forgot about it. He would have continued forgetting about it if it hadn't been for the gala. Carter Financial's annual charity event was a big enough deal that even the building maintenance crew got a mention in the internal memo. Formal attire ballroom level proceeds to 3 local nonprofits, including one that served children who had lost a parent to illness. Daniel got the memo because his company maintained the building. He was not obviously invited to the gala. He was there because the ballroom's auxiliary cooling system had thrown an error code at 6:47 p.m., 40 minutes before the event began, and the on-call dispatcher had reached Daniel because he was already downtown picking up Sophie from her after-school program and the tower was 8 blocks away. He dropped Sophie at his neighbor Mrs. Alderman's apartment with a hasty explanation, and his phone number drove to the tower badged into the service entrance, and spent the next 35 minutes in a mechanical room under the ballroom fixing a sensor that had failed because someone had stacked decorative boxes against a ventilation return and blocked the airflow. He was washing his hands in the service corridor sink when the door to the ballroom opened, and a woman in a wheelchair backed through it. Not backed, reversed. Efficiently, purposefully using just the left wheel to pivot herself sideways through the door while holding it open with her right hand, in the particular way people who use wheelchairs develop when the architecture of a space was designed by someone who had never thought carefully about the architecture of a space. She was wearing a different blazer than the one from the corridor, midnight blue. Her hair was down. She saw him and stopped. "Mr. Carter," she said. He was still in his work clothes, dark pants, company polo with the maintenance logo tool bag over his shoulder. "Ms. Hart," he said. "Cooling sensor in the auxiliary unit. You should be good for the rest of the evening." She nodded. She didn't move back toward the door. He noticed then that her jaw was set in the way people's jaws get when they are working very hard not to show something. "Are you all right?" he asked. He didn't know why he asked it. It wasn't his place to ask. Evelyn Hart looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the smallest exhale he had ever seen from someone trying not to make noise, she said, "My head of investments just told me that one of our major partners is withdrawing. I have 200 people in there, half of them press, and I have to walk back in and give a speech about resilience." The word walk registered between them for half a second, and then she blinked just once and said, "Poor word choice." "It happened to me once," Daniel said. "Not the investment part, the having to hold it together when everything inside is falling apart." She looked at him. "What did you do?" He thought about Sophie asking him to buy cereal. He thought about 12 seconds and feet on the floor. "I gave myself 12 seconds," he said, "to feel it. And then I moved." Chumbe. She was quiet. Outside the door, he could hear the murmur of 200 people, the clink of glasses, the low swell of a string quartet. 12 seconds, she repeated. "It doesn't fix anything," he said, "but it gets you through the door." Evelyn Hart straightened in her chair. She put both hands on the wheels. She looked at the door. "Mr. Carter," she said, not looking at him. "Yes. Thank you for fixing the cooling system." "Yes, ma'am." She pushed through the door. He heard from inside the room settle into attentive quiet as she moved toward the front. He stayed where he was until he heard her voice steady, unhurried, carrying the weight of someone who has learned to carry weight, and then he picked up his tool bag and went home. He picked Sophie up from Mrs. Alderman's at 9:30. Sophie was half asleep, draped over the couch with a juice box, and when Daniel lifted her, she wound both arms around his neck and put her face against his shoulder, the way she'd been doing since she was an infant. "Did you fix it?" she murmured. "Yeah, baby. I fixed it." "Good." She was asleep before they reached the car. He buckled her into her booster seat in the dark, stood there for a moment with one hand resting on the doorframe looking at her small face. He thought about Evelyn Hart saying resilience in a room full of people who didn't know that 2 minutes earlier, in a service corridor, she had given herself exactly enough time to almost break, and then hadn't. He thought about 12 seconds. He got in the car and drove home. The email came 11 days later. It was from Carter Financial's facilities department regarding the ventilation replacement he had recommended. Standard stuff, scheduling parts list, cost approval. His name had been flagged on the work order as the recommending technician. What was not standard was the second email from an address he didn't recognize, which arrived 3 minutes after the first. "Mr. Carter, I'm told you filed the initial fault report and recommended the unit replacement. The new system performed well during last week's board presentation. I wanted to say thank you personally. E. Hart." Daniel read it twice. Then he typed back, "Glad it held up. D. Carter." He hit send before he could second-guess it. Her reply came in 4 minutes. You were right about the 90-minute threshold. The presentation ran 88 minutes. I've been thinking about that. He stared at his phone. About the presentation, he wrote. About knowing your limits exactly well enough to work just inside them. He read that 3 times. That's either very disciplined, he wrote, or very exhausting. Her reply took 7 minutes. Why not both? He sat with his phone in his hand in the break room of the building he was servicing, surrounded by the sound of a commercial refrigerator humming and traffic 2 floors below, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, he laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. It wasn't the kind that turns heads. But it was real, and it had been a while. Sophie noticed the phone before she noticed anything else, which was very Sophie. "You're smiling at your phone," she said, looking up from her homework with the unsettling accuracy that children deploy when you are not prepared for it. "I'm not smiling at my phone." "Dad, you are literally smiling at your phone right now." "It's a work email." "Work emails don't make you smile." He put the phone face down on the table. Sophie looked at him for a long moment with her mother's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that could make Daniel feel on certain days like time had gotten confused about which direction it was supposed to move. "It's okay," she said, very quietly, going back to her homework. "I just want you to be happy." He looked at her. 7 years old, 1 pink sock, the drawing on the refrigerator with its enormous smiles. "We are happy." He believed her. He did. But there was a difference he was beginning to remember between being happy enough and wanting something more. The thought scared him enough that he didn't pick the phone back up for the rest of the evening. He picked it up at 11:14 p.m., after Sophie was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. He typed, "Can I ask you something?" The reply came quickly, too quickly for someone who should have been asleep. "You already did." "Fair," he wrote. "Why are you awake? Why are you—" He looked around the quiet kitchen, the drawing on the refrigerator, the single coffee mug in the dish rack, the chair across the table that had been his wife's chair that he still hadn't moved, that he wasn't ready to move. "I'm not sure," he wrote. "Some nights the quiet gets loud." A long pause, long enough that he thought she might have set the phone down. Then, yes. Exactly that. He sat with that for a long time. Outside, a car moved past on the street below. The refrigerator hummed. The city made its low, constant sound. He wrote, "How do you carry it? The whole thing, the company, the pressure, the—" He stopped, deleted the last part, wrote instead, "How do you keep going when it's a lot?" Her answer, when it came, was not what he expected. "I don't always. Some nights I sit by the window and I let myself think about everything I lost, the version of myself I thought I'd be, the things I assumed would happen that didn't. And then I go to sleep, and I get up in the morning." 12 seconds, he wrote. 12 seconds. He put the phone on the table and looked at it. He thought about the way she had looked at that ballroom door, the set of her jaw, the single exhale. He thought, "This woman is very alone." And then immediately, "So are you." He picked up the phone. "Would you want to get coffee sometime? Just coffee. No agenda." The pause was shorter than he expected. "I don't really do coffee." He felt the door closing. "But I do." She wrote, "Do dinner. If you know somewhere quiet." He sat very still for a moment. Then he typed the name of a place, a small Italian restaurant 3 miles from downtown, the kind with paper tablecloths and candles in wine bottles, the kind nobody from her world would ever think to look. "Thursday," he wrote. "Thursday," she replied. He set the phone down. Outside, the quiet city turned, and somewhere upstairs, his daughter slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who believed entirely and without evidence that everything was going to be all right. Daniel Carter sat alone at his kitchen table. And for the first time in 3 years, he let himself think about Thursday. Thursday came the way things come when you have been trying not to think about them suddenly, and with the particular weight of something you cannot take back once it begins. Daniel changed his shirt 3 times. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 6:40 p.m. in a blue Oxford button-down and told himself this was not a date. It was dinner. 2 people who had spoken honestly to each other in a service corridor and then continued speaking honestly through a phone screen meeting in a quiet restaurant to see whether the honesty would survive 3-dimensional space. That was all. He believed that for approximately 4 minutes. Then Sophie appeared in the bathroom doorway, looked at him in the mirror and said, "You're wearing the good shirt." "This is just a regular shirt." "Dad, that's the shirt you wore to Uncle Marcus's wedding rehearsal dinner." "It's a blue shirt. I own several blue shirts." Sophie leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed in a posture she had absolutely not learned from him. "Who are you having dinner with?" "A colleague." "What kind of colleague?" "The professional kind." She narrowed her eyes. She was 7, and she was already alarmingly good at this. "Is the colleague a lady?" Daniel picked up his watch from the counter and put it on. "Mrs. Alderman is coming at 7. There's leftover pasta in the fridge, and you can watch 1 show before bed. 1 show, not 1 episode of a show, and then accidentally another episode." "That only happened twice." "It happened 4 times. Sophie unfolded her arms. Something shifted in her face. The interrogation dropped away, and underneath it was something quieter and more careful. "Dad," she said, and her voice was different. "You can tell me." He looked at her. 7 years old. Her mother's eyes. "I'm having dinner with someone I met through work," he said carefully. "It's just dinner. I don't know what it is yet." Sophie thought about this for a long moment. Then she nodded with the solemnity of someone granting permission they had the right to grant. "Okay," she said. "Wear the watch Grandpa gave you. It looks better." He was already wearing it. He didn't tell her that. He kissed the top of her head, said goodnight 3 times the way he always did, and walked out the door before he could give himself another 12 seconds to reconsider. The restaurant was called Della's, and it sat on a side street in the West Loop, the kind of place with 10 tables and a handwritten menu board, and a owner named Sal, who had been making the same 4 pasta dishes for 30 years and saw no reason to change them. Daniel had found it 6 months after his wife died, when he needed somewhere to sit with a glass of wine and not be noticed, and it had become the only restaurant he went to alone, without feeling more alone when he left. He got there 8 minutes early. Old habit. Evelyn got there 4 minutes later, which meant she had also gotten there early, and waited somewhere close before coming in, which told him something about her, that he filed away without comment. She was wearing a dark red blouse. Her hair was down again the way it had been the night of the gala. She navigated to the table he had chosen corner away from the window, minimal foot traffic, and pulled up beside it without waiting for anyone to help her, because of course she didn't. "You picked a good table," she said. "I've had practice." "No." Sal appeared, looked at both of them with the particular discretion of a man who had learned over 30 years that people came to his restaurant specifically because he did not ask questions, took their orders, and disappeared. The silence after he left was not uncomfortable. That surprised Daniel. "You're not what I expected," Evelyn said. "You said that in your head," Daniel said. "But you said it out loud." She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved. "Is that a problem?" "No, I was thinking the same thing about you." "What did you expect?" He considered being diplomatic. "Someone who doesn't listen," he said. "You have a reputation for being very certain about things." "I am certain about most things," she said. "That's different from not listening." Fair point. She picked up her water glass. He noticed that her left hand had a slight tremor, barely visible, gone in a second, and he made the same decision he made every time he noticed something about a person that they hadn't chosen to share. He moved on. "You have a daughter," she said. "Sophie, 7. How long have you been doing it alone?" 3 years. She didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. Most people said they were sorry. The word had started to feel over 3 years like a door being closed rather than opened. "It's hard," she said instead. A statement, not a question. "It's hard," he agreed. And then she says something, or does something, and you think, okay, this is worth anything. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was careful. The way voices get when someone is approaching something they don't normally approach. "I was supposed to have children," she said. "That was the plan before the accident. I was 36. We had just started talking about it seriously." She looked at the table. "After it didn't seem possible in the way I had imagined it." "But medically," he said, and then immediately, "Sorry, that's not my business." "Medically, yes," she said. "It was always possible. It was just the picture I had of how that life would look changed so completely that I couldn't find the new picture." The food arrived. Sal placed it without ceremony and left without ceremony, two qualities Daniel deeply respected. Then they ate. They talked. And what surprised Daniel most was not the things she said, but the way she listened with the full, undivided attention of someone who had learned somewhere along the way that most people aren't actually listening. They're just waiting for their turn to speak. She listened like listening was a decision she was actively making. He noticed that too, and filed it away. "Tell me about the accident," he said about 40 minutes in. She looked at him. Most people he knew either avoided the subject entirely or asked with a kind of hungry curiosity she had learned to recognize and deflect. He asked the way you ask someone about something that matters to them, not something you want to collect. "I was 36, she said. "Black ice on the 290. I was driving home from a board meeting at 11 at night because I worked until 11 at night as a personal policy, and a truck coming the opposite direction lost control and crossed the median." She said it evenly, the way you say something you have said enough times that the words have separated themselves from the feeling. "I woke up in the ICU. My spine was damaged at L2. The doctors were honest. They told me I would not walk again." "How long before you went back to work?" She looked at him again, that assessing look that he was starting to recognize as her version of surprise. 4 months. "Was that too soon?" "Everyone thought so." "What do you think?" "I think I would have disappeared if I'd stayed home any longer." She set her fork down. "The company was the thing I still had complete control over. When your body becomes something you have to negotiate with every single day, having something that responds to your decisions the way you expect it to, that matters more than people understand." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I went back to work 9 days after my wife's funeral," he said. "My mother-in-law thought it was cold. My supervisor thought it was brave." He paused. "It was neither. I just needed something to fix. I'm better at problems I can fix." Evelyn looked at him across the paper tablecloth and the candle in the wine bottle for a long moment. "So am I," she said quietly. They stayed until Sal started stacking chairs at the other tables, the universal language for a restaurant that was done for the evening. Outside, the November air was sharp enough to matter. Daniel walked beside her to the car her driver had pulled to the curb, and they stood for a moment in that particular silence of an evening that has gone well and that neither person wants to formally end. "This was good," Evelyn said. "It was. I don't do this," she said. "Dinners. I want you to know that." "I don't either." She looked at him. "But you'd do it again." It wasn't quite a question. He answered it anyway. "Yeah," he said. "I would." Her driver opened the car door. She moved alongside it with the same practiced efficiency she brought to every physical space. Before she got in, she looked back at him once. "Daniel," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. "Thank you for not mentioning the wheelchair once tonight." He met her eyes. "Why would I?" he said. "It's not the most interesting thing about you." She held his gaze for 1 beat. 2. Then she got in the car, and the door closed, and he stood on the sidewalk watching the taillights move away until they turned the corner and disappeared. He stood there for an extra moment in the cold air. Then he smiled, walked to his truck, and drove home. The babysitter was gone. Sophie was asleep on the couch in front of the television, which she had technically turned off. The remote was in her hand, but she was clearly completely asleep. He picked her up. She murmured something. "Hey, baby," he said. "Time for bed." "How was dinner?" She mumbled, eyes still closed. "It was good." "Did you wear the watch?" "I wore the watch." A pause. "Good," she said, and went fully back to sleep. He carried her upstairs in the dark. He thought about Evelyn saying thank you for not mentioning the wheelchair once tonight. He thought how many times had someone mentioned it that she learned to be grateful when they didn't. He tucked Sophie in, stood in the doorway of her room for the 3 seconds that had become another ritual without his intending it, and went to bed. He slept better than he had in months. He didn't tell himself why. The second dinner was 2 weeks later. Then the third 2 weeks after that. By the fourth, they had stopped calling them dinners. They were just Thursday, a word that had quietly accumulated a weight it hadn't carried before. Sophie stopped asking who he was meeting. She just checked on Thursday afternoons whether he was wearing the good watch. He always was. What they built across those months was something he didn't have a clean word for. It was not courtship in the way he understood courtship. It was closer to excavation. The slow, careful process of two people who had each buried something important, digging back down to find it. Evelyn talked about her company with the precision and passion of someone who genuinely loved the thing she'd built. And Daniel, who had never had particular interest in finance, found himself listening the way you listen to someone who loves something real, not to understand the thing, but to understand the person. She talked about her investors and her board, and the quiet, constant effort of being the only person in a room who used a wheelchair, while simultaneously being the person everyone in the room was waiting to impress or challenge or underestimate. She talked about that last part rarely and carefully, and only after the fourth dinner, and only because he asked directly, "Does it change how you have to operate?" he said, in the room. She was quiet for a moment. "Every room I walk into..." She stopped, looked at him. "Every room I enter," she corrected deliberately. "I've already been assessed before I've said a word. I've been sorted into a category. The category is remarkable given the circumstances." "That's a cage," Daniel said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, as if she had been waiting a long time for someone to simply name it. "That's exactly what it is." He told her about Sarah. Not all of it. You don't tell all of something like that in one sitting because all of it is too large to carry through a door at once. But he told her about the morning of the accident, about the hospital phone call, about the 12 seconds that had become the structural support of his entire life. He told her about Sophie asking for the cereal and how that had been in some ways the hardest moment, harder than the funeral, harder than the first night alone, because it was the moment the ordinary world asked him to keep going and he didn't know yet whether he could. Evelyn listened to all of it without moving. When he finished, she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "She sounds like she was extraordinary." "She was ordinary," he said. "That's what made her extraordinary. She was just herself completely, all the way through." His voice stayed even. "I haven't met many people like that." Evelyn held his gaze. "Neither have I." Between the 6th and 7th Thursday, something shifted.
Bus.
He wasn't sure who moved first, or whether movement was even the right word for it. It was more like the space between them, which had always been defined by a careful and mutual respect for the distance, stopped being comfortable at its original size. Like a room that was the right size for two people who were one thing and became without anyone deciding the wrong size for two people who were becoming something else. The 7th Thursday, he drove her home instead of her driver picking her up because the driver had a family emergency, and she told him it was fine. She'd get a car service, and he said he'd drive her, and she said that wasn't necessary, and he said he was aware it wasn't necessary, and she looked at him for a long moment and said, "All right." Her building was a glass tower on the lakefront, which he had expected. What he hadn't expected was the quiet in the elevator, which was a different kind of quiet from the restaurant, smaller, more aware of itself. "You don't have to walk me up," she said, when the elevator opened on her floor. "I know." He walked with her anyway to the door of her apartment. She turned the key, turned back. They were close enough that he could see in the dim hallway light the specific expression she wore when she was working something out. "Daniel," she said. "Evelyn." She exhaled. "I have spent 6 years being very careful," she said, "about what I let myself want. I know. I'm not good at this. You're better than you think." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and put one hand against his chest, not pulling him closer, not pushing him back, just resting it there, as if checking whether something was real. He stayed completely still. "I don't know what this is," she said quietly. "Neither do I," he said, "but I'd like to find out." She looked at her hand against his chest, then at him. Then she moved her hand and turned back to the door. "I'll see you Thursday," she said. "Yeah," he said. "You will." He took the elevator back down, sat in the parking garage in his truck for 2 full minutes doing nothing at all. Then he drove home, picked up Sophie from Mrs. Alderman's, listened to her explain the entire plot of the show she had watched in perfect, exhausting detail, put her to bed, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. He picked up his phone. He put it down. He picked it up again. He typed, "I'm glad we started this." Her reply came in 3 minutes. "So am I. Good night, Daniel." He sat in the quiet kitchen with his phone on the table and the drawing on the refrigerator and the chair that had been Sarah's chair, and he thought about Evelyn's hand on his chest, the weight of it, the careful realness of it. He thought about how long it had been since someone had wanted to know whether he was real. He sat there for a while. And then the phone buzzed again. A second message. 3 words, and he read them twice before he moved. "Don't be scared." He looked at those 3 words for a long time. Then he smiled a real one, the kind that gets away from you before you can think better of it, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. He was still scared. But he went to sleep. The months that followed were the kind of months that only make complete sense in retrospect when you look back at them and see the architecture of something being built. Even though while you were living through them, it felt like nothing more than Tuesday and then Thursday and then Tuesday again. They kept their lives separate in the ways that mattered for each of them. Daniel's world was school pickups and maintenance calls and dinner with Sophie and occasional Friday night beers with his friend Marcus, who kept asking who he was smiling about and kept receiving non-answers. Evelyn's world was board meetings and quarterly reports, and the constant invisible labor of running a billion-dollar company from a wheelchair in an industry that still in ways overt and subtle, and sometimes both at once treated her presence as a variable to be managed. But Thursday was Thursday. And gradually, slowly, then faster than either of them had expected, Thursday stopped being the only day. She texted him on a Tuesday when a board member blindsided her with a motion she hadn't anticipated, not to ask for advice, but because she needed to say it out loud to someone who would hear her as a person and not as a position. He called her on a Sunday evening when Sophie had a nightmare and he couldn't get her to stop shaking, and Evelyn talked to him quietly for 20 minutes until Sophie fell back asleep, and then kept him on the phone for another 10 minutes without either of them saying much, because sometimes the line between 2 people in the dark is enough. Sophie still didn't know who Evelyn was. Not exactly. She knew there was a woman. She knew her father was happier. She had, in the manner of a 7-year-old who has absorbed more than adults, assumed, stopped asking questions and started watching. Watching the way he held his phone. Watching the way on Thursday evenings he came home lighter than he left. She had said once to Mrs. Alderman in the kitchen when she thought Daniel was out of earshot, "I think my dad has a friend." Jada. Mrs. Alderman had said, "Is that okay with you?" Sophie had thought about it for what seemed to her like a very long time. "I think Mom would want him to have a friend," she said finally. "She always said he didn't have enough of them." Daniel, standing in the hallway, had not moved for a full 30 seconds. Then he walked into the kitchen, like he hadn't heard anything, poured himself a glass of water, and asked Sophie if she'd finished her homework. She looked at him with those gray-green eyes and said, "Dad, I always finish my homework." "I know," he said. He drank the water. He looked out the kitchen window. He thought Sarah always said that. He doesn't have enough friends. He thought, you were right. You were always right. He put the glass in the sink. He did not let himself cry in front of Sophie. He never did. But that night after she was asleep, he sat in the kitchen and held his phone and sent Evelyn one message. "You would have liked her, my wife. You two would have been terrifying together." A long pause. The kind that in a phone conversation would be filled with the sound of breathing. Then, "Tell me something about her." And he did. He told her 3 things, small things, the kind that don't make it into eulogies, but are the actual substance of a person. And when he finished, Evelyn wrote back, "She sounds like someone who told the truth." And then, "That's the rarest thing." He sat with that in the dark kitchen. He sat with it for a long time. And the city turned around him, quiet and enormous, and somewhere in a glass tower on the lakefront, a woman he hadn't planned on sat by a window he imagined but had never seen, and the space between them was smaller than it had ever been. Not small enough yet, but closer. Getting closer. Go. And then came the Thursday in March that he would replay in his mind for a long time, after because it was the Thursday, when everything that had been moving slowly and carefully suddenly moved all at once. She had called him that afternoon, not texted, called, and her voice had a different quality to it. Something wound tight underneath the surface. "I need to see you tonight," she said. "What happened?" "I'll tell you when I see you." He arranged for Mrs. Alderman. He drove to Della's. He got there before her and sat at the corner table and waited. She came in out of the cold with her jaw set and her eyes sharper than usual, and she navigated straight to the table and sat across from him and said before Sal had even come over, "Someone on my board is planning to move against me. I have 3 weeks to figure out how to stop it." "Tell me everything," Daniel said. And she did. And what happened next? The way he leaned forward, the way she watched him listen, the way the conversation moved from the crisis to the strategy, to something quieter and more fundamental underneath both, was the moment the last careful distance between them closed. Not with a dramatic gesture, not with a declaration, just with the specific, irreversible knowledge that there was no version of the coming weeks and months that either of them wanted to move through alone. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked down at it. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a long time. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. Outside, March moved through the city, cold and restless, and full of the particular energy of something that is about to change. And inside Della's, at the corner table away from the window, 2 people who had each survived the unsurvivable sat across from each other in the candlelight and held on. It was the simplest thing. It was everything. And 3 months later, on a rainy Thursday in June, in the same corner of the same restaurant, when the spring had finally committed to being summer, and the city had remembered what warmth felt like, Evelyn Hart set something on the table between them. Small, plastic, white. Daniel looked at it. He looked up at her. Her expression was the one he had come to know best. The composed surface, and underneath it, moving like a current under still water, something enormous and unresolved. Her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant." The word landed in the space between them like a stone dropped from a height. Daniel Carter, who had survived grief and rebuilt himself from the ground up and learned to love quietly and without expectation, sat very, very still. And for the first time in 3 years, he didn't have 12 seconds. He had no seconds at all. He just sat there in the silence of the thing she had just said, feeling the entire careful architecture of both their lives shift on its foundation. And the rain came down outside. And neither of them moved. The plastic test stayed on the table between them for 11 seconds. Daniel counted without meaning to, the way you count things when your brain needs something mechanical to hold on to while the rest of you catches up to what just happened. 11 seconds. Then he picked it up, looked at it, set it back down. "How long have you known?" he said. 4 days. Her voice was steady in the way that voices get when someone has been rehearsing steadiness. "I took 3 tests. All the same." "Okay." He said the words slowly, not as a response, but as something to stand on while he found his footing. "Okay. Daniel, give me a second. Take whatever you need." He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at the candle. He breathed. Outside, the rain was steady and indifferent, the kind of June rain that doesn't care what it's interrupting. He had imagined a lot of things over the past months. He had imagined carefully, and then less carefully, a future with this woman, something slow-built and honest, something that moved at the pace of 2 people who had both been damaged by speed. He had imagined eventually telling Sophie. He had imagined the conversation with Marcus, who would say something embarrassing and then be genuinely happy. He had imagined in the vaguest possible terms what it might look like for his small, carefully managed life to expand. He had not imagined this. "Are you all right?" he asked, because that was, he realized, the first question that mattered. Something in her expression shifted, a small crack in the composure quickly sealed. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've been processing." "Alone, for 4 days." "Yes." "Evelyn." He said her name the way he said it when she was doing the thing she did where she managed something enormous entirely by herself, because asking for help felt like conceding a vulnerability she couldn't afford. "Why didn't you call me?" "Because I needed to know what I thought about it before I knew what you thought about it." She held his eyes. "I needed my own answer first." He understood that. He didn't entirely like it, but he understood it. "And what's your answer?" he said. She looked at the test on the table, then at him. "I want to keep it," she said. I know what it means. I know what it does to everything. But I have wanted this in some part of myself. I stopped listening to 6 years ago for a very long time." Her voice didn't waver, but her hands resting on the table's edge tightened almost imperceptibly. "So that's my answer. What's yours?" Daniel Carter looked at this woman across the table, this complicated, brilliant, fiercely private woman who had placed a pregnancy test between them, the way she placed everything difficult directly without softening it, trusting him to handle the truth. He thought about Sophie at 7, saying "we are happy" with complete certainty. He thought about Sarah's chair at the kitchen table, still unmoved. He thought about the specific quality of Evelyn's voice on the phone at 11 at night, when the quiet got loud. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked at him. "That's my answer," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "You don't know what you're agreeing to. Tell me." She exhaled, and then she did. And she told him about the board. 9 members, 4 of whom had been waiting with the patience of people who had learned that patience was a competitive advantage for any crack in her authority large enough to push through. She told him about her chief legal officer, Richard Harmon, who had warned her 6 months ago that her personal life was scrutinized in ways male CEOs simply did not experience, and that any development that could be framed as instability would be used. She told him about the competitor, Marcus Webb, CEO of a rival firm, who had been quietly positioning himself as an alternative for her largest institutional investors, and who would not need to manufacture a scandal if one was handed to him. They will say I had a relationship with an employee, she said. I'm a contractor. I'm not an employee. The distinction will not matter in a headline. She looked at him steadily. They will say you pursued me for financial gain. They'll dig into your background, your finances, your history. They will find everything uncomfortable and put it in the worst possible light. She paused. Your daughter will be in the middle of it. I need you to understand that. Daniel was quiet. I'm telling you this, she said, because you deserve to make an informed decision, not because I want you to leave. He looked at her for a long moment. Are you telling me to leave? No. Are you asking me to leave? No. The word was immediate and certain. I am telling you that staying will cost you something real. And I need you to know that before you decide. He looked at the test on the table. He thought about Sophie in the hallway asleep, completely trusting that he would always be the kind of man who made the right call. He thought, what is the right call? And then underneath that quieter, you already know. Evelyn, he said. 3 years ago, I stood in a hospital parking lot at 3 a.m. and made the decision to get up every day and be a father to a little girl who had just lost her mother. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know if I could. I did it anyway, because she needed me to, and because walking away from the people you love when it gets hard is not something I know how to do. He met her eyes. This is hard. I understand that. And I'm still not going anywhere. Evelyn Hart, who ran a billion-dollar company and had not cried in a board meeting in 6 years, looked at him across the paper tablecloth. She blinked once. Then she said, okay. One word. But the way she said it, with the specific release of someone who has been holding something very heavy and has just carefully set it down, told him everything. Okay, he said back. Why? And then Sal came over to refill the water. Looked at the two of them, looked at the pregnancy test on the table, said absolutely nothing, refilled the water, and left. Daniel looked at the test. Then at the door Sal had disappeared through. Then back at Evelyn. He's not going to say anything, Daniel said. No, she agreed. I've been coming here for 3 years. I know. A pause. Then, despite everything, despite the weight of the last 20 minutes, despite the rain and the board and Richard Harmon and Marcus Webb and the headlines that hadn't been written yet but would be, Daniel Carter started to laugh. It came out of nowhere the way real laughter does, and Evelyn looked at him for a startled half-second, and then the corner of her mouth moved, and then she was laughing too quietly, the sound of it mixing with the rain against the glass. It lasted about 15 seconds. Then it was over and the situation was still the situation. But for 15 seconds, it had been something else. We have to tell people, she said. One person at a time, he said. Starting with Sophie. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. This one had weight in a new direction, not the weight of uncertainty, but the weight of what comes next. She's 8 in September, he said. I know. She's going to have a lot of questions. I imagine so. She's going to want to meet you. Evelyn's expression shifted in a way he hadn't seen before, something underneath the composure that was not fear exactly, but was adjacent to it. I know, she said again more quietly. He looked at her. You're not nervous about the board, he said. You're nervous about Sophie. She held his gaze for a beat. The board I know how to handle, she said. An 8-year-old whose father I've been seeing for 7 months, without her knowing, that's a different kind of examination. Sophie doesn't examine people, he said. She just loves them or she doesn't. That's exactly what I mean. He understood that too. He paid the bill. She had stopped arguing about that around month 3, when she'd realized that it was not about money for him, but about something else, some private code she'd eventually decided to respect. They went out into the rain. Her driver was waiting. They stood at the curb for a moment. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. Yes. Get some sleep. She looked at him. Daniel. A pause. Thank you for not running. He looked at her steadily. I told you, he said. I don't do that. She held his eyes. Then she nodded once. Not the corporate nod, not the boardroom nod, the other one, the small and private one, that meant she believed him. She got in the car. He stood in the rain and watched the taillights disappear for the second time in 7 months. This time was different. This time, everything was already different. He drove home in the rain with the radio off, thinking in the slow, careful way he thought about things that were too large to think about quickly. He parked in front of his building and sat in the truck for 3 minutes. Then he went upstairs, paid Mrs. Alderman, thanked her, locked the door, and stood in the kitchen. Sophie's drawing was still on the refrigerator, 2 stick figures, both smiling. He looked at it for a long time. Then his phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. You alive? You were supposed to call me back 2 hours ago. He stared at the message. He thought about calling Marcus right now, telling him everything, hearing Marcus say something terrible, and then something true. He put the phone face down on the counter. Not tonight. Tonight he needed to be alone with the size of this. He sat at the kitchen table. He thought about Evelyn's voice saying, I want to keep it. He thought about the way she'd looked when she said it, not defiant, not desperate, but resolved in the way she was resolved about things she'd already made her peace with. She'd made her peace with it before she told him. She'd done it alone in 4 days, the way she did everything enormous, privately, completely, and without asking anyone for permission to feel it. He thought that as a person who has been alone for a very long time. He thought not anymore. And then his phone buzzed again. Not Marcus. Evelyn. I've been thinking about what you said, about not walking away from people when it gets hard. He looked at the message. I need you to know something, she continued. I've been telling myself for 6 years that I was fine alone, that it was a choice, not a circumstance. Tonight was the first time I admitted to someone other than myself that I was wrong. He read it twice. Then he typed, Thank you for telling me. A pause. Then her, It wasn't easy. I know. I'm going to have to tell my board before it leaks. I have maybe 2 weeks. We'll figure it out. Daniel. A pause between messages. What if they push me out? He sat with that question. The real question under it, not about the company, but about whether she was at the bottom of everything the same person she'd been before the accident. Whether the company was the proof. Whether losing it would mean losing that proof. He typed slowly. You were who you are before that company existed. They can't take that. A very long pause. Then, good night. Good night, Evelyn. He put the phone down. He went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. 3 days later, it started. He didn't know how it started, who made the first call, who placed the first anonymous tip, but by Wednesday morning, his supervisor called him into the office and said with genuine discomfort that someone from a financial news publication had called the company asking whether Daniel Carter had a personal relationship with Evelyn Hart. Daniel sat across from his supervisor, a decent man named Phil, who had worked in building maintenance for 22 years and had no framework for this conversation. Do you? Phil said. Yes, Daniel said. Phil looked at him for a long moment. Dan, she's... I know who she is. The publication said they're running a story, something about a conflict of interest, you being on the maintenance contract for her building. I'm a contractor. She doesn't control my schedule or my salary. I know that, but the way they're going to write it... Phil stopped, picked up a pen, put it down. I got a call from our legal department this morning. They're worried about liability. Daniel felt something cold move through him. They want to pull me from the Carter financial contract. They want to talk about options. Phil. He kept his voice flat and even. I have done nothing wrong. I believe you. Then say that to legal. Phil looked at him. I will. But Dan, you need to be ready. This kind of thing gets big fast. Daniel drove home from that meeting on autopilot. He called Evelyn from the parking lot. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she was either waiting for his call or her day was already bad enough that she was keeping the phone in her hand. They called my company, he said. I know. Her voice was controlled but tight. Richard just told me. The same publication reached out to our PR office this morning. They have a source inside the building, I don't know who yet. A pause. I'm sorry, Daniel. Don't apologize. I brought this to your door. We brought it together, he said. Don't do the thing where you take responsibility for everything. A short silence. Richard wants me to issue a statement, she said. Distancing. Something vague about maintaining professional boundaries. What do you want to do? I want to burn the statement and the person who drafted it. A beat. But that's not strategic. What does your gut say? My gut says the minute I distance myself from you in public, I've told every person in my company and every person watching that I'm ashamed of something I'm not ashamed of. Her voice was sharp and clear. And I refuse to do that. Then don't. It will make everything harder. Evelyn, you've been doing hard for 6 years. What's one more? The silence that followed was the kind he'd learned to read not empty, but full. Processing. There's something else, she said. The phrasing. The pause before it told him it was worse. Webb's team made contact with 2 of my board members this morning, she said. He's not waiting anymore. He's moving now while there's noise. How much time do you have? An emergency board meeting can be called with 72 hours notice. A pause. Richard thinks they'll call one within the week. Daniel sat in the parking lot of his company's office with the afternoon sun coming through the windshield and thought very fast and very clearly. He thought about what he knew about Evelyn. Not Evelyn Hart, the CEO, but Evelyn who sat at a corner table and listened. Like listening was a decision who had 4 days of fear alone before she trusted him with it, who had said, I want to keep it with the voice of someone who had stopped asking the world's permission to want things. Who on your board will hold, he said. 4, maybe 5. You need 5 to block a removal motion. A pause. You've been doing research. Sophie goes to bed at 8:30. I have time. Something shifted in her voice. I need 5 to block, she confirmed. I have 4 I'm certain of. The 5th is Raymond Cho. He's been neutral, but he respects he's a self-made man. He responds to integrity over optics. Then talk to Raymond Cho, Daniel said, before they do. I'm meeting him for lunch tomorrow. Good. Another silence. Then, Daniel, the story about us, when it runs and it will run, they're going to write about Sophie too. They'll use her photograph if they can find one. He felt it hit him in the chest clean and hard. He had known this was coming. He'd known it since Della's, since the rain, since he'd said, I'm not going anywhere. He had known it and chosen anyway. Knowing something and feeling it arrive he was relearning 2 entirely different things. I'll talk to her tonight, he said. She needs to hear it from me before she sees anything. I can, if it would help, I'd like to be there. He hadn't expected that. You want to meet her tonight? Only if you think it's right. A small hesitation, and in it he heard something he recognized, the sound of someone reaching for something they were afraid to reach for. I don't want her to feel like I'm a stranger who disrupted her father's life. I'd rather be a person she's met. Daniel looked at the dashboard. He thought about Sophie's gray-green eyes. He thought about, I think my dad has a friend, and I think Mom would want him to have a friend. Come at 7, he said, before her bedtime. A pause. Okay. And Evelyn, she's 8. She's going to ask you exactly what she wants to know, and she's not going to soften it. Good, Evelyn said. I'll do the same. He actually smiled at that. Briefly. 7, he said. I'll make pasta. Ding! He spent the rest of the afternoon in a kind of focused calm that he recognized as the mental state he entered when everything external was out of his control, and all he could manage was what was directly in front of him. He went home. He started water boiling. He got Sophie from the after-school program, buckled her in, and drove home with the radio on low. "Dad," Sophie said from the back seat. "Yeah." "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The face where you're thinking about something big, and you're trying to figure out how to say it to me." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "I have something to tell you tonight," he said. "And someone I want you to meet." Sophie looked at him in the mirror. "The lady with the watch." He exhaled. "I never told you about a lady with a watch. Mrs. Alderman said the woman you were seeing was very successful and wore a beautiful watch the one time she saw you two talking outside the building. A beat. Mrs. Alderman talks when she's knitting." "Mrs. Alderman talks all the time." "Is she nice?" Sophie asked. "The lady." "She's complicated," he said honestly, "and kind, and very smart. And she's going to come over tonight, and I need you to be yourself." "I'm always myself." "I know. I just wanted to say it out loud." Sophie looked out of the window. She was quiet for about 30 seconds, which for Sophie was a geological era. Then, "Is she going to be part of our family?" Daniel kept his eyes on the road. He thought about the pregnancy test on the table. He thought about how to answer this question for an 8-year-old in a way that was true without being more than she was ready to carry. "I think she might be," he said carefully. "We're still figuring it out." Sophie nodded slowly. Then, "Does she know about Mom?" "Yes." "Good," Sophie said. "That matters." He didn't say anything. He just drove. At 6:53 p.m., the buzzer rang. Daniel pressed the intercom, heard the familiar sound of wheels on the lobby floor through the speaker, and pressed the door release. He looked at Sophie, who was sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread out in front of her in a careful arrangement that she absolutely had not been sitting at 5 minutes ago. "She's coming up," he said. Sophie straightened the homework. "Okay," she said in the voice of someone trying very hard to sound casual. The knock came. Danielle opened the door. Evelyn was there in the hallway, her watch catching the corridor light. Her expression composed in the boardroom way, and then she looked past Daniel to the kitchen table and saw Sophie, and for one unguarded second, the composure slipped. Just for a second. But Daniel saw it. It was not fear. It was something closer to what he'd felt the first time he'd driven home from a Thursday dinner, the feeling of wanting something to be real so much that the wanting itself was frightening. Sophie looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Sophie. Daniel stood between them in the doorway of his apartment holding his breath. And Sophie, who had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of cutting through everything straight to what mattered, put down her pencil, looked at Evelyn Hart directly and said, "Does my dad make you happy?" The hallway was completely quiet. Evelyn blinked once. Then she looked at Sophie with the full, undivided attention of someone making a decision, and she said with a steadiness that had nothing to do with boardrooms, "Yes, he does." Sophie looked at her for another long moment. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said, and picked up her pencil. "He makes really good pasta. You should stay for dinner." Daniel let out the breath he had been holding. Evelyn looked at him, and in her eyes underneath everything, underneath the board meeting and the publication and the 72-hour notice period, and all of it was something that looked unmistakably like relief, like someone who had been standing outside a door for a very long time had just been let in. He stepped back. "Come in," he said. She did. And Sophie, without looking up from her homework, said, "There's a chair across from Dad. It's been empty for a while. You can have it." Daniel turned toward the stove so that neither of them could see his face. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the pot handle and the water boiling and the sound of his daughter's pencil moving across paper He breathed. 12 seconds. Then he started to cook. Sophie ate 2 full bowls of pasta. That was the thing Daniel noticed most. Not the conversation. Not the careful way Evelyn answered questions. Not the moment Sophie had leaned across the table and asked with complete seriousness whether being in a wheelchair hurt. It was the 2 bowls of pasta, because Sophie only ever ate 2 bowls when she was comfortable, and Sophie was very selective about comfort. Evelyn had answered the wheelchair question the way she answered most of Sophie's questions, directly, without condescension, the way you talk to someone whose question deserves a real answer. "It doesn't hurt," she'd said. "It's just how I move through the world. Like how some people wear glasses to see. It's just my version of that." Sophie had thought about this for approximately 3 seconds, and then said, "Okay," and asked whether Evelyn liked pineapple on pizza, because that was apparently the more pressing issue. Evelyn did not like pineapple on pizza. Sophie had looked at Daniel with an expression of profound vindication. "See," she'd said, "see?" He had smiled and said nothing and gone back to eating. After dinner, Sophie showed Evelyn her drawing. Not the one on the refrigerator, a new one she'd done that afternoon, which she produced from her backpack with the casualness of someone who had definitely planned this and was pretending she hadn't. It was the 3 of them. 2 tall figures and 1 small one. All smiling enormous smiles. Evelyn had looked at the drawing for a long time. Long enough that Sophie had said, "You can keep it if you want." Evelyn had looked up from the drawing. "I'd like that very much," she said. Sophie had nodded, satisfied, and gone to brush her teeth. Daniel had stood in the kitchen doorway watching Evelyn hold that drawing, and he had thought, whatever happens next, the board, the publication, all of it this moment is real, and no one can take it back. It was 8:45 when Evelyn left. Sophie was asleep. Daniel walked her to the elevator, and they stood in the hallway, in the particular quiet of an evening that had been more than either of them had prepared for. "She's extraordinary," Evelyn said. "She's her mother's daughter," he said. Then after a beat, "And mine, a little." Evelyn looked at the drawing still in her hands. "She drew me standing," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, careful, layered. Daniel looked at the drawing. He hadn't noticed. In Sophie's picture, Evelyn was upright, same as Daniel and Sophie, stick figure legs under a stick figure body. Enormous smile. "Kids draw what they see," he said quietly. "She sees you." Evelyn looked at him. Her jaw was set in the particular way that meant something was happening underneath the surface that she was not going to let happen on the surface. "Good night, Daniel," she said. "Good night." The elevator opened. She went in. The doors closed. He stood in the hallway alone for a moment. Then he went back inside, locked the door, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the empty chair across from him. He thought tomorrow it starts. He was right. The story ran at 6:14 a.m. on a Thursday. Of course it was a Thursday under the headline, "Heart Capital CEO in Undisclosed Relationship with Building Contractor. Conflict of Interest. Questions Emerge." The publication had a photo taken from a distance, grainy, but clear enough, of Daniel and Evelyn outside Della's from 2 months ago, standing at the curb in the kind of proximity that left nothing ambiguous. Daniel saw it at 6:20 when Marcus sent it to him with a text that said, "Call me. Now." He called. "How long?" Marcus said, skipping everything. 7 months. A very long pause. "Dan." "I know. She's Evelyn Hart. I'm aware of who she is. And you didn't tell me. I'm telling you now." Another pause. Marcus exhaled. "Okay. Are you okay?" "I'm fine." "Is Sophie?" "She's fine. She met Evelyn last night." The silence that followed was the sound of Marcus recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the last 7 months. "And," he said, "Sophie gave her a drawing." "Oh, man," Marcus said, and in 2 words communicated the full spectrum of emotions available to a man who has watched his best friend grieve for 3 years and is now watching something else happen. Okay, what do you need? Nothing right now. I just needed you to know. I'm coming over after work. Marcus. I'm coming over after work, Dan. That's not negotiable. He let it go. Fine. He got Sophie up, got her fed, got her to school. She did not look at his phone. She did not see the headline. When he dropped her at the steps, she hugged him around the middle, the way she always did, and ran up without looking back, same as every morning, and he stood there watching her until the door closed. He had until 3:15 before she might encounter anything. He drove to work. His phone rang 11 times in 2 hours. He answered 2 of them, one from his supervisor Phil, who had seen the story, and one from a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be a journalist asking for comment, to whom he said nothing and hung up. His inbox had 47 emails by noon. He read none of them. Evelyn called at 11:30. They're calling the board meeting, she said. The moment he picked up, no greeting. 72 hours notice. It was filed this morning at 8 a.m. They moved fast. How fast? Faster than Richard expected, which means they had the meeting motion drafted before the story ran. A beat. They placed the story Daniel. This wasn't a leak. This was strategy. He sat in his work truck in a parking garage and felt the anger move through him, clean and clarifying, the kind that doesn't cloud judgment but sharpens it. Webb, he said. His PR firm, we think. We can't prove it yet. Her voice was controlled, but he could hear what was underneath it. Not fear, fury, the cold, focused kind. Richard pulled the board motion this morning. The language they're using is conduct unbecoming of executive leadership and potential conflicts of interest impacting fiduciary responsibility. That's corporate language for "we found a reason." Yes. A pause. Raymond Cho called me at 9 a.m. What did he say? He said he'd seen the story. He asked me one question. Another pause. He asked whether I was ashamed of anything. Daniel waited. I told him no, she said. What did he say? He said good, then act like it. She let that sit for a moment. He's with us. That's 5. Daniel breathed out. That's enough to block the motion. To block removal, yes, but they'll find other mechanisms. Censure. Restructuring my authority. This is not a one-day fight, Daniel. I need you to understand that. I understood that at Della's in the rain, he said. Nothing has changed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm making a public statement this afternoon. Not through PR, not through Richard. Me directly on the company's public communications channel. Another pause. I'm going to tell the truth. All of it. A silence that told him she'd been wrestling with this since 6:14 a.m. Not the pregnancy. Not yet. That's ours. I won't make that public until we're ready. Her voice was careful. But the relationship. That I'm with you. That I'm not ashamed of it. That the insinuations about conflict of interest are false, and that the timing of this story is not a coincidence. A beat. I'm going to put my name on it and not hide behind corporate language. Are you sure? No, she said immediately. But I'm doing it anyway. He thought about her at the ballroom door, the exhale, the set of her jaw, the decision to walk back in. Call me after, he said. I will. She hung up. He sat in the parking garage. He thought about Sophie seeing a headline with her father's name in it. He thought about the photo from outside Della's and how many people would see it today and what they would assume. He thought about his company's legal department and Phil's careful face. He thought about Evelyn saying, I won't make that public until we're ready. We. Ma. That word had been doing a lot of work lately. He noticed it every time she used it. She noticed herself using it. He could tell there was a small pause before it every time, like she was testing the weight of it, making sure it would hold. He called Phil. "I need to know where we stand," he said. Phil had the grace to be direct. "Legal says they want to review the contract. They're not terminating anything they want to review." "How long does a review take?" "Could be 2 weeks, could be 2 months. You know how legal is." "Am I suspended during the review?" A pause. "No, you're just not assigned to Carter Financial Properties during the review period." "That's fine," Daniel said. "I can work around it." "Dan." Phil's voice dropped. "I want you to know personally, not as your supervisor. I think this is garbage. You're a good technician and a good man, and whatever is happening in your personal life is none of anyone's business." "Thank you, Phil." "That said, legally, I have to follow the process." "I know. I'm not asking you not to." He hung up. He stared at the steering wheel. He thought, this is what it costs. He'd known there would be a cost. He'd told himself he'd understood it. But understanding it in the abstract and sitting in a parking garage watching it arrive in real time, whereas he kept relearning completely different things. Chummy. He drove to his next job. He worked. He was good at working. It was the thing that had always been most reliable about him, the ability to focus on the problem in front of him when everything around it was chaos. He replaced a faulty circulation pump in a building on the near north side and diagnosed a coolant issue in an office building in Wicker Park, and by 2:30 he had 4 hours of billable work done, and his hands were dirty, and his mind was quieter than it had been all morning. At 2:47 p.m., his phone showed a notification from Hart Capital's public communications channel. He pulled over. He read it. It was written in Evelyn's voice, not corporate language, not PR softened language, but her actual voice, the one he recognized from 11 p.m. text messages and across paper tablecloths. It said that the story published that morning was accurate in one respect and inaccurate in its framing. It confirmed that she was in a relationship with Daniel Carter. It stated clearly that he had no financial relationship with Hart Capital Management, no access to proprietary information, and no influence over any business decision. It stated that the timing of the story was not coincidental, and that she was aware of the interests it served. And then it said something that stopped him mid-breath. "Shane, I have spent 6 years allowing my personal life to be treated as a liability. I have accepted without comment the assumption that a woman in my position must choose between professional legitimacy and private humanity. I am done accepting that assumption. My relationship is not a conflict of interest. It is not a scandal. It is not anyone's business except mine and the person I am in it with. I am sharing it publicly, not because I owe anyone an explanation, but because I refuse to allow my silence to be used as a weapon against me or against him. I am not ashamed. I am not hiding, and I am not going anywhere." Yeah. He read it twice. Then he sat in his pulled-over truck on a side street in Wicker Park and pressed his knuckles against his mouth and did not let himself make the sound that was trying to happen in his chest. He typed one message. That was brave. Her reply was immediate. That was necessary. There's a difference. Is there? A pause. Maybe not today. He smiled, pulled back into traffic, got Sophie from school at 3:15 the way he always did. Sophie had heard something. He could tell the moment he saw her face, not the full story, not the details, but the particular expression of a child who has overheard something at school that she doesn't fully understand, but knows is about her. She got in the car, buckled her seatbelt, said nothing for about 40 seconds. Then, Madison Chen's older sister told Madison that your girlfriend is famous. "Evelyn," he said, "not my girlfriend. Her name." "Evelyn," Sophie repeated carefully. "Is she in trouble?" "Some people are trying to make things difficult for her at work," he said. "Because of me, because of us." Sophie absorbed this. "Because you're not rich." The directness of it hit him. "That's part of it," he said honestly. "That's stupid," Sophie said. "Yeah," he agreed. It is. Sophie looked out the window. Is Evelyn scared? I think she'd say she's focused. That's what you say when you're scared, but you're not going to let it stop you. He glanced at her in the rear view. When did you get so smart? I've always been this smart, Sophie said. You're just finally paying attention. He almost ran a yellow light. That evening, Marcus came over as promised, bringing beer. He didn't offer Daniel and pizza. He didn't share with Sophie, who told him pineapple was a violation, and he said it was an innovation, and they argued about it for 6 minutes while Daniel sat on the couch and felt for the first time all day something close to normal. After Sophie went to bed, Marcus sat across from him at the kitchen table. The kitchen table, the chair that had been Sarah's, the chair that Evelyn had sat in the night before, and said, "Talk to me." Daniel talked. He told Marcus everything start to finish, Della's, the texts, the Thursday dinners, the pregnancy test on the table. All of it. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was not his natural state, and required visible effort. When Daniel finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's pregnant." "Yes." "And you're staying?" "Yes." Marcus nodded slowly the way he nodded when he was processing something large. "Are you happy?" he said. The question landed clean and simple in the middle of everything complicated. Daniel thought about it honestly. "I think I'm terrified," he said, "and I think yes." "Both of those can be true," Marcus said. "I know." Marcus picked up his beer. "Sarah would have liked her," he said. Not asked, said. Daniel looked at the table. "I told Evelyn that." "And?" "She said Sarah sounds like someone who told the truth." He paused. "Which is, that's exactly it. That's the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about her in one sentence." Marcus was quiet. Then he put the beer down and said, "What do you need?" "Nothing right now." "When you need something, you call me." "I know. I mean it, Dan. I don't care what time it is." "I know, Marcus." He left at 10. Daniel locked up, turned off the lights, sat for a moment at the kitchen table in the dark. His phone showed 17 missed calls, 3 voicemails from journalists, 1 email from a lawyer he didn't recognize that he would deal with tomorrow, and 1 text from Evelyn sent at 9:48 p.m. Raymond Cho called again. "He wants to meet you." Daniel read it twice. Me, specifically. He said he wants to know the man his CEO is standing beside. His words. "When?" "Saturday morning. Breakfast. He'll come to you." Daniel stared at the message. Raymond Cho was 71 years old, self-made, the son of Korean immigrants who had built a shipping logistics company from 4 trucks to a national operation before selling it and moving into investment. He had a reputation for asking one question and reading everything he needed from the answer. "Okay," Daniel typed. Saturday. Then he put the phone down and sat in the quiet kitchen and thought about everything that had been set in motion, the board meeting in 72 hours, the statement Evelyn had made, the story that was circulating, Sophie's drawing in Evelyn's hands, the chair across the table. The board meeting was 48 hours out when the second story ran. This one was worse. A different publication linked to the first, but with more detailed sources described as people familiar with Hart Capital's internal concerns, who said that Evelyn's personal entanglement had created a distraction during a critical business period, that she had been emotionally compromised in recent months, that board members were privately concerned about her judgment and stability. And the word stability was doing specific, deliberate work. Daniel recognized it the same way Evelyn recognized it, as a word chosen not for its accuracy, but for its implication. A word designed to plant a question in the minds of investors and partners who had always found reasons to wonder whether a woman in a wheelchair, however accomplished, was truly the most reliable long-term choice. Evelyn called him at 7:03 a.m. "I saw it," he said before she spoke. "They're using disability language," she said. flat, cold. The fury so compressed it had become something else precision. They're not saying it directly because they can't legally, but stability, judgment, compromised, that's a specific vocabulary for a specific audience. I know. Daniel, I have been fighting this vocabulary for 6 years. I have won every single argument. I have outperformed every benchmark. I have done everything right. Her voice, for the first time in his memory, had something cracked at the edges. And they are still going to try to use my body as evidence of my unfitness. He held the phone with both hands. He didn't say anything immediately because the moment didn't need words yet. It needed someone to hold it with her. I know, he said finally. Quietly. I'm so angry, she said. I know. Be angry. You're allowed. A silence. And then, she said, and then you walk into that board meeting and you show them the difference between their vocabulary and your record. A pause. And I'll be there. I can't be in the room, but I'll be there. She breathed, in and out, slow. Raymond Cho sent me an email this morning, she said. What did it say? It said, I've read both articles. I'll see you at the meeting. Don't change anything. A pause. That's 5 votes. That's enough. Then you have what you need. For this meeting, she said. This is not the last one. No, he agreed. It's not, but it's the next one. She exhaled again. The compressed quality of her voice loosened just slightly. How are you this calm? She said. I'm not calm, he said. I just learned a long time ago that panic doesn't fix anything. I fix things. That's what I do. A pause. Is that a metaphor? I work in building maintenance, Evelyn. Everything I say sounds like a metaphor. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. Get through today, he said. I'll call you tonight. Yes. Evelyn. Yes. You are not unstable. You are the most structurally sound person I have ever met. The silence that followed was long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then her voice came back lower than before. Thank you. He hung up. He got Sophie ready for school. He dropped her at the steps. He watched her run up without looking back. He drove to meet a retired CEO of a shipping empire who wanted to look him in the eye. Raymond Cho was already seated when Daniel arrived at the diner Saturday morning. 71, with the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have made enough decisions that they've stopped being anxious about making them. He was drinking black coffee. He stood when Daniel approached, shook his hand with both of his, and sat back down. Thank you for coming, he said. Thank you for asking, Daniel said. Cho looked at him the way he'd been described, one long measuring look, the kind that doesn't linger or perform itself, but simply takes in what it needs. Then he picked up his coffee cup. I'm going to ask you one question, Cho said. All right. When this is at its worst, the media, the board, the pressure on your livelihood and your daughter and everything else, what are you going to do? Daniel looked at him. He didn't think about the answer. The same thing I do every morning, he said. Get up and take care of the people who need me. Cho looked at him. Then he nodded once slowly, the way you nod when something confirms what you already believed. Good, he said. He set the coffee down. Now let's eat. I want to know about your daughter. And that was that. And all. The board meeting was Tuesday at 9 a.m. Daniel spent Monday evening with Evelyn on the phone, not talking about the meeting. They had talked about the meeting enough, but about other things. About the way Sophie had called her twice over the weekend, ostensibly to ask about something she'd seen on television, but actually, they both understood just to hear her voice. About the baby, which they had spoken about carefully and quietly, like something sacred they were both still learning to approach. About names. Briefly. Tentatively. Evelyn had said one name and then stopped herself and said, "It's too early," and Daniel had said, "I like it anyway," and she'd been quiet for a moment, and then said, "I do too." He barely slept. He was on a job site by 7 a.m., a school in Pilsen with a boiler issue because working was what he did when he needed to hold on to something reliable, and the job kept his hands busy and his mind from running the board meeting on a loop for 2 hours. His phone was in his pocket. He felt it every time it didn't buzz. At 10:47 a.m., it buzzed. He was elbow deep in a boiler housing. He pulled his phone out with one clean hand and read the message. One sentence. Motion failed. 5-4. I'm still here. He stood in the boiler room of a school in Pilsen with one dirty hand and one clean hand and read that sentence 3 times. Then he typed back, "I know." He put the phone in his pocket. He went back to work. He fixed the boiler. It was what he did. That evening he picked Sophie up, brought her homemade dinner. She talked through the entire meal about something that had happened at recess with a girl named Destiny, who had, according to Sophie, made a series of deeply unreasonable decisions regarding a jump rope. Daniel listened to all of it. He asked questions. He said the right things. After dinner, Sophie looked at him across the table. "Did Evelyn's work thing go okay?" she said. He looked at his daughter. "It did," he said. "She's okay." Sophie nodded. She picked up her plate and carried it to the sink, which she always did when she was satisfied that things were as they should be, a small private ritual of correctness. "Good," she said, rinsing the plate. "She's tough." "Yeah," Daniel said. "She is." "Like you," Sophie said completely offhandedly, setting the plate in the dish rack and walking past him toward the living room. He sat at the table for a moment after she'd gone. He thought about Evelyn's text. 5-4. I'm still here. He thought about Sophie's drawing, the 3 of them smiling enormous smiles that was currently on Evelyn's refrigerator in the glass tower on the lakefront. He thought about the baby, the name they hadn't decided on yet, the conversation that was still ahead of them. He thought about the chair across the table that Sophie had told Evelyn to take that matter-of-factly, that easily, the way children offer things that adults make complicated. He thought about a rainy Thursday in June, and a plastic test on a table and 12 seconds, and a woman who said, "I'm not ashamed," in front of the world and meant it. He got up. He cleaned the kitchen. He went and sat next to Sophie on the couch and watched whatever she was watching without asking what it was. She leaned against his arm. He put his arm around her. Outside, the city moved in its enormous, indifferent way. Inside, the kitchen was clean. The chair across the table was no longer empty. And for the first time in 3 years, Daniel Carter did not need 12 seconds. He was already exactly where he needed to be. The pregnancy became public on a Wednesday. Not because someone leaked it, not because a journalist cornered the right person in the right parking garage. It became public because Evelyn Hart decided it would on her terms, in her words, at a time she chose, and that decision, Daniel had come to understand, was the most Evelyn thing she had ever done. It had been 3 weeks since the board meeting, 3 weeks of relative quiet that neither of them trusted, because they had both lived long enough to know that quiet after a storm is not peace. It is the interval between waves. The first story had circulated and been discussed and been argued about on financial news channels, where people who had never met either of them debated whether a CEO's personal life was relevant to her fiduciary competence. The second story had done its damage and then receded. Webb's attempt to accelerate the board motion had failed by 1 vote, and Raymond Cho had released a brief statement through his personal communications channel. Not Hart Capital's, saying that he had full confidence in Evelyn Hart's leadership and that attempts to conflate her personal life with her professional performance reflected poorly on the people making them. That statement had landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples were still moving. But 3 weeks of quiet had not been 3 weeks of stillness. Behind the quiet, Evelyn had been working. She had met individually with each of the 4 board members who had voted against her, not to argue or to plead, but to do what she did better than almost anyone. Daniel had ever observed. She listened, identified the actual concern underneath the stated one, and addressed it directly. 2 of the 4 had shifted perceptibly by the end of those conversations. The other 2 hadn't, but they were no longer the threat they had been. Webb had gone quiet, in the way that powerful men go quiet when they realize the move they committed to hasn't worked, recalculating, not retreating. And underneath all of it, the pregnancy continued. 16 weeks. Evelyn's doctor had confirmed everything was progressing as it should, which was a sentence that Evelyn had received with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for the other shoe to drop for so long that good news feels provisional. "You don't believe her," Daniel had said in the car after the appointment. "I believe the data," Evelyn had said. "That's the same thing." "It's not the same thing. Evelyn." A pause. "I believe her," she'd said, more quietly. I'm not used to things going as they should." He had reached across and put his hand over hers on the armrest. She had turned her hand over and held his. They had driven the rest of the way in the kind of silence that is not the absence of conversation, but the fullness of it. The decision to go public came out of a conversation that started as many of their most important conversations did late at night. She had called him at 10:52 p.m. on a Tuesday, which meant something was turning in her head that she couldn't resolve alone. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "You called me instead of sitting with it, which means you've already been sitting with it for a while." A beat. "I hate that you can read me." "No, you don't." Another beat. "No," she agreed. "I don't." She paused. "I'm going to show soon. Physically. It's been easy to manage so far, but another 4 weeks and it won't be." She said this practically the way she said physical realities directly without drama, the way someone states a fact about weather. When that happens, it becomes a story again. Someone photographs me. Someone posts something. And then it's out and it's framed by someone else. And everything that happens after is a response to their framing. "Or," Daniel said, "or I choose when and how and what." "Yes." She was quiet. He could hear her moving the soft sound of her chair, the way it shifted when she repositioned herself. He had learned to read her by sound, the way she had learned to read him by expression. "If I announce the pregnancy, I'm also fully confirming the relationship," she said. "On the record. Undeniably. There's no version of the announcement that allows any ambiguity." "Good," he said. "I'm tired of ambiguity." "Daniel." A pause. "My investors, some of them are conservative. Not politically, just culturally. They have assumptions about what stability looks like. A pregnant CEO, without a husband on record, is going to trigger some of those assumptions." "Then give them something to look at instead of their assumptions," he said. "Give them your record. Give them Raymond Cho. Give them the truth about who you are. What if it's not enough?" He thought about Sophie saying she's tough like you. He thought about Evelyn at the ballroom door, the 12 seconds, the exhale. "It'll be enough," he said. "But even if it isn't, Evelyn, you cannot spend your entire life making yourself smaller to fit inside other people's comfort. You told me that yourself. You used different words, but that's what you said." The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that meant she knew he was right and was deciding whether to say so. "Saturday," she said finally. "I'll release the statement Saturday morning." "Do you want me to read it first?" "I already wrote it." A pause. "I wrote it 2 weeks ago." He absorbed that. "You've been sitting on it for 2 weeks." "I was waiting to know if it was the right time." "What changed?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sophie called me tonight, just to talk. And at the end of the call she said," another pause, longer. "She said, 'I can't wait for the baby.' Just like that. I can't wait for the baby. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Like it was already the most natural thing in the world." He sat with that. "She's 8," Evelyn said quietly. "She's not hiding anything. She's not calculating anything. She just said the true thing." "Yeah," he said. "She does that." "I want to be more like her," Evelyn said. Daniel Carter sat at his kitchen table at 11 p.m. and felt something move through him that he didn't immediately have a word for. He found the word a moment later. It was gratitude, simple and enormous, and almost unbearable in its completeness. "Send the statement Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she confirmed. He heard her exhale the one he recognized, the one that came after a decision was made. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Evelyn." He sat at the table for a long time after that in the dark, not thinking about anything in particular. Just sitting, just being in the quiet apartment with Sophie asleep upstairs and the drawing on the refrigerator and the chair across the table. Just being where he was completely. The statement ran at 8 a.m. on Saturday. Daniel read it at the kitchen table while Sophie was still asleep with coffee. He'd made too strong, and the early morning light coming through the window. It was longer than the first one, but it had the same quality, her voice real and precise, with no softening and no performance. She confirmed the pregnancy. She confirmed the relationship. She said that she had considered how and whether to share this, and had decided that the only position consistent with her values was honesty, because she had built a company on the principle that transparency was not a liability, but a foundation. She said that she was a woman who used a wheelchair and who was pregnant, and who was in a relationship with a man she loved, and that none of those things were in conflict with her ability to lead, and that anyone who believed otherwise was welcome to examine her performance record for the past 6 years. She said that she was not performing strength. She was not performing resilience. She was just living her life and declining to be ashamed of it. And at the very end she said this: "The person beside me is not a story. He is a man who showed up when showing up cost him something, who has never once treated my limitations as the most interesting thing about me, and who is going to be a remarkable father. I am not lucky to have found him. I earned him the same way I have earned everything else, by refusing to accept that the life I wanted was not available to me." Daniel read that last paragraph 4 times. Then he put his phone face down on the table and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called her. She answered on the second ring. "I read it," he said. "I know." "You said you loved me," he said. A pause. "I was hoping you'd lead with a different observation." "Evelyn." He kept his voice even. "You said it in a public statement before you said it to me." Cheers. Another pause. Longer. "That was a tactical error," she said, and her voice had the quality it got when she was embarrassed and was not going to admit to being embarrassed. "In my defense, I wrote the statement 2 weeks ago, and at the time I was processing a number of things simultaneously, and the language felt accurate, and I didn't fully think through the sequencing." "The sequencing," he repeated. "Daniel." "Evelyn Hart," he said. "Do you love me?" "Shay." The silence was exactly 4 seconds long. He counted. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." "It's not obvious," he said. "Say it like it's not obvious." Another pause. He heard her breathe. "I love you," she said. Without the corporate armor, without the precision, just the words in her voice at 8:17 on a Saturday morning. He sat with it. "Good," he said. "I love you too." "I know," she said, and in 2 words he heard everything she had been carrying for however long she had known it and hadn't said it. "Get off the phone," he said gently. "You're going to have a full day." "That's an understatement. Call me tonight." "Yes." He hung up. He put the coffee mug down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in pajamas, with her hair in complete disarray, looked at him and said, "Why are you smiling at the ceiling?" "Good morning," he said. "Dad?" "Evelyn made a statement this morning," he said. about the baby, and about us. Sophie processed this. Is it good or bad? It's honest, he said, which I think is both. Sophie went to the refrigerator, got out the orange juice, poured herself a glass with the focused concentration she applied to tasks involving liquids since the incident of February. Is she going to be okay? She said. Yeah, he said. She's going to be okay. Sophie drank her juice. She looked at him over the rim of the glass with those gray-green eyes. You love her, she said, not a question. Yeah, he said. She loves you too, Sophie said, completely matter-of-fact. I could tell when she had dinner here. She looks at you like she's still surprised you're real. He looked at his daughter. What? Sophie said. Nothing, he said. You want eggs? Obviously, she said and climbed onto her chair. He made eggs. Baba. The response to the statement was not what any of the people who had been trying to frame the narrative had anticipated. That was the first thing that became clear by noon on Saturday: the comments, the shares, the responses from people inside and outside the financial world who had read the statement and responded not to the financial angle, but to the human one. Employees of Hart Capital posted publicly about working for a leader who told the truth. Women in executive positions shared the statement with brief commentary that amounted to variations of, "This is what it looks like to refuse to shrink." A disability advocacy organization issued a statement praising Evelyn's public refusal to accept the framing of her wheelchair as a liability. 3 of Hart Capital's institutional investors released brief, careful statements of continued confidence. Webb was silent. Richard Harmon called Evelyn at noon and said with the specific relief of a lawyer who had spent 3 weeks preparing for a worst-case scenario, "This is not the outcome I modeled." "I know," Evelyn said. "The sentiment is it's overwhelmingly positive. I'm looking at the numbers and I don't understand it." "Richard," she said, "people respond to honesty because they almost never encounter it. It surprises them. That's not complicated." The board can read the same numbers you can," she said. "Let them." She called Daniel after she hung up with Richard. "He said he didn't model this outcome," she said. "What outcome did he model?" "Manageable damage." A pause. "He didn't model no damage." "Because he was modeling the wrong variable," Daniel said. "He was modeling what the board would think. You were talking to people." She was quiet for a moment. "Raymond Cho sent me a text," she said. "What did it say?" "Well done. 2 words. That's the most effusive thing Raymond has ever said to anyone." "You're set," Daniel said. "For now." "For now is enough," he said. "For now is all any of us ever have." She exhaled. "When did you get philosophical?" "Sophie's been rubbing off on me." She laughed. A real one, unguarded, the kind that had taken him 3 months of dinners to hear the first time, and that he had never taken for granted since. The weeks that followed moved fast. Not the frantic speed of crisis, but the purposeful speed of things falling into place. Evelyn's second quarter numbers came out, and they were strong, stronger than the previous year, stronger than the analyst projections that had been quietly adjusted downward during the board drama. She presented them in a meeting where 4 of the 9 board members had the specific expression of people who had made a calculation error and were working out how to present that gracefully. Marcus took Daniel to lunch and said, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For thinking when you first told me that you might be in over your head." "I am in over my head," Daniel said. "Yeah, but you're swimming," Marcus said. "That's different." Sophie started spending more time with Evelyn. Not officially, nothing was official, yet they had agreed to let things develop at the pace that felt right for Sophie, but in the easy, gradual way of water finding its level. Evelyn came to dinner on Sundays. Sophie called her on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, initially with questions, and then sometimes just to talk. They had developed without any adult engineering, a specific relationship with its own texture and language. Evelyn talked to Sophie like she was intelligent, which Sophie was. Sophie asked Evelyn questions nobody else asked, which Evelyn needed. One Sunday evening, Daniel was cleaning up the kitchen while Evelyn and Sophie sat at the table working on something, a puzzle. He thought, though, it had migrated from a puzzle into an elaborate argument about the correct strategy for puzzles, and he stood with his back to them at the sink and listened to his daughter's voice mixing with Evelyn's and felt clean and complete the thing he had been reaching toward for 3 years without knowing exactly what he was reaching for. He finished the dishes. He dried his hands. He turned around. Sophie and Evelyn were both looking at him. "What?" he said. "We were just talking," Sophie said, "about names." He looked at Evelyn. She had the expression she wore when Sophie had done something that surprised her, the unguarded one, the one that had nothing to do with boardrooms. "Were you?" he said. "Sophie has opinions," Evelyn said. "Sophie always has opinions." "I think it should be a name that means something," Sophie said with the authority of someone who has fully considered the matter. "Not just a name that sounds nice. A name that's for a reason." Evelyn looked at Daniel. Something passed between them, the specific communication of two people who have been through enough together that some things don't need words. "We'll think about that," Daniel said. "I already have a list," Sophie said, and produced a folded piece of paper from her pajama pocket. He looked at her. "How long have you had that?" "A while," she said, unfolding it. He sat down at the table. Evelyn moved her chair to make room. They looked at Sophie's list together, the three of them at the kitchen table, where the chair had been empty for 3 years and was now unmistakably occupied. The baby came in December. 6 days before Christmas at 4:47 in the morning, in a hospital room where Daniel sat with Evelyn's hand in both of his and did not let go for 11 hours. The delivery was complicated in the specific ways the doctors had told them. It might be because Evelyn's body was not a body that had ever done anything easily or without negotiation, and she negotiated it the way she negotiated everything, with absolute refusal to accept any outcome other than the one she had decided on. It was a girl. Sophie had been at Mrs. Alderman's, and when Daniel called her at 5:03 a.m., she answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. "Is she here?" Sophie said. "She's here," he said. He heard Sophie exhale, then quietly, fiercely, "Good." He went back into the room. Evelyn was holding the baby with the focused, wondering expression of someone who has arrived at a place they had stopped believing they would reach. She looked up when Daniel came back in. "Sophie says good," he said. Evelyn looked down at the baby. "That's Sophie," she said softly. He sat beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders carefully. She leaned into him the small specific amount that was her version of completely. They sat like that for a while, the three of them, the four of them, while the hospital moved around them in its nighttime way, and the city outside continued. Being the enormous, indifferent city it had always been, and inside the room there was only this: a man who had learned to get up every morning, a woman who had refused every limitation the world tried to hand her, and a new life that had arrived small and absolute in the earliest hour of a December morning. They named her Ruth. Sophie had put it on her list, third from the top. When Daniel had asked her why, she'd said, "It means companion, someone who stays." She'd thought about it for a moment and then added, "That seemed right." It seemed right. It was right. The complications that followed the birth were not catastrophic, but they were real, and they required 10 days in the hospital instead of 4. And during those 10 days, Daniel did what he always did. He showed up. He was there every morning before the nurses changed shift. He was there when the doctors gave updates that required Evelyn to absorb difficult information and make quick decisions. He was there when the information was good, and he was there when it was not, and he made the distinction between those two things as small as possible. Because Evelyn needed steadiness more than she needed his reactions to things. Marcus brought food to the hospital on day 3 and sat in the waiting room for 2 hours and didn't ask to come in because he understood without being told that some rooms are full enough. Sophie came every afternoon after school. She sat beside Evelyn's bed and talked about her day with the particular detailed accuracy of someone delivering a full report, and Evelyn listened with complete attention, and Ruth slept in the bassinet between them. And Daniel watched from the doorway on more than one occasion and did not look away until he was sure he had the expression on his face under control. The board meeting in January, the first full board meeting since Ruth's birth, was the one that Daniel thought of later as the meeting that closed the chapter. Not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing dramatic happened. The quarterly report was presented. The numbers were discussed. Evelyn ran the meeting with the same precision she always had, and when a board member whose name Daniel had learned to associate with a particular flavor of bad faith attempted to introduce language about the upcoming year's leadership review. Raymond Cho asked one clarifying question about the financial basis for the motion, received an inadequate answer, and moved to table the discussion. It was tabled. The meeting continued. Evelyn called Daniel from her car afterward. "How was it?" he said. "Boring," she said. "Mercifully professionally boring." He breathed out. "Good boring or bad boring?" "The best kind," she said. "The kind where nothing is happening because everything has already been decided." Webb was not there. His firm announced last week that they're consolidating some of their investment focus. The polite language for retreating. Daniel sat with that for a moment. "So it's over," he said. "This part," she said. "There will always be a next part. That's how it is." A pause. "But this part is over." He nodded to himself in the empty kitchen. Sophie was at school. Ruth was asleep in the next room in the crib that Daniel had assembled on a Sunday afternoon, while Evelyn watched from the doorway and told him he was putting the side rail in upside down, which he was. "Come for dinner tonight," he said. "Sophie has something she wants to show you." "What is it?" "I don't know. She told me it was a surprise and that if I looked, she'd know." "And would she know?" "Yes," he said. "Somehow, yes." Evelyn made a sound that was warm and real. "I'll be there at 6. She was there at 5:52 because she was always early and had stopped pretending otherwise. Sophie met her at the door with the specific energy of someone who has been waiting and is now maximally ready. "Close your eyes," Sophie said. Evelyn looked at Daniel. He raised his hands in a gesture of genuine ignorance. She closed her eyes. Sophie guided her through the apartment. Daniel watched this, the way Sophie's hand rested on the armrest of the wheelchair and directed with small, confident adjustments, the natural ease of it, the complete absence of hesitation into the kitchen. "Okay," Sophie said. "Open." "Hey." On the refrigerator next to the original drawing, the 2 stick figures with enormous smiles, the one that had been there for 8 years, was a new drawing. 4 figures. 1 tall one, medium one, in a wheelchair, and 1 very small one. All of them smiling the enormous smiles that Sophie drew on everyone, because she believed with the absolute conviction of a child who had learned this from somewhere deep and true, that smiling was the honest representation of a life being lived right. Under the drawing in Sophie's careful printing, "Our Family." Daniel stood at the counter with his hand on the edge of it. Evelyn sat in front of the refrigerator and looked at the drawing for a long time. Long enough that Sophie, who had infinite patience for the things she cared about, waited without speaking. Then Evelyn reached up and pressed one hand flat against the drawing, just rested it there against the paper, against all 4 smiling figures. "It's perfect," she said. Her voice was steady, her eyes were not. Sophie looked at Daniel. He shook his head almost imperceptibly, let her have it. Sophie nodded, understanding completely. Ruth made a small sound from the next room. Sophie was already moving. "I've got her," she said with the authority of an 8-year-old who has decided she is a big sister and that the role requires action. Evelyn lowered her hand from the drawing. She looked at it for another moment. Then she turned to Daniel, and the expression on her face was the one he had first seen in a service corridor 3 years ago. Not the composed version, not the boardroom version, but the one underneath all of it. The one that was just her. "Thank you," she said. He crossed to her. He crouched down so they were eye level. He looked at her. "For what?" he said. "For not running," she said. "For every time you could have and didn't." He held her eyes. "I told you," he said. "The first time. That's not something I know how to do." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I believed you. I just needed to say it out loud." From the other room, Sophie's voice. "She's smiling. Dad, come see, she's smiling." Daniel looked toward the sound. He looked back at Evelyn. "Come on," he said. He stood. She moved beside him. They went together into the other room where Sophie was holding Ruth with the focused, reverent care of someone entrusted with something irreplaceable, and Ruth, 6 weeks old, small and new, and entirely unimpressed by the complications that had surrounded her arrival, was in fact smiling. Or doing the thing that newborns do that looks exactly like smiling. The distinction in that room at that moment did not matter. Sophie looked up at them. "See?" she said. "Yeah," Daniel said. "I see." He stood in the doorway of that room, with Evelyn beside him, and his daughter, holding his daughter, and thought about 12 seconds. About feet on the floor. About every morning he had gotten up when getting up was the hardest thing, and done it anyway, because the people who needed him to. He thought about a service corridor and a rainy Thursday, and a plastic test on a table, and a statement that said, "I am not ashamed," and a chair that had been empty for 3 years and was empty no longer. He thought about what it had cost, and what it had returned, and whether the accounting made sense. It made sense. Not the way a balance sheet makes sense, clean and provable, and without remainder. The way a life makes sense when you look back at it from the right angle, not without loss. Not without the weight of everything it took to get here, but whole. Recognizably, unmistakably whole. Ruth made another sound. Sophie adjusted her hold with the automatic confidence of someone who has decided she knows what she is doing and is probably right. Evelyn's hand found Daniel's. He held it. Set. Outside Chicago moved through its winter in the enormous, indifferent way of cities that have seen everything and will outlast everyone. Inside the apartment was warm, and Sophie was talking to Ruth in the low, earnest voice she used for things that mattered. And Daniel Carter stood in the doorway with his hand in Evelyn Hart's hand. And for the first time in a very long time, the 12 seconds were not something he needed. Because he was not bracing himself against anything. He was not managing the distance between who he was and who he needed to be. He was simply here, all the way here, completely in the life he had chosen and been chosen by, in the middle of the ordinary, extraordinary fact of it. And that was enough. That was it, turned out everything.